we've got just about a minute before we go to the news. I understand we have...
Andy.
From Fremont on line 1. Go ahead.
Andy.
Hey, Dr. Crane. Long time, first time. I'm calling in because I have a conundrum. I don't know what to take out of this pack from my cube. I mean, do I stay open and take like a Maze Mind Tome or a Phyrexian Metamorph or Gitaxian Probe, or do I just commit to Mono Red and go Eidolon of the Great Revel and just go all in, or Prismatic Vista maybe, fixing? Turn Timber Symbiosis is really great, right? I mean, modal double face cards are strong. Can you please help? Any direction would be really helpful.
Andy?
At Cornell University, they have an incredible piece of scientific equipment known as the tunneling electron microscope. Now, this microscope is so powerful that by firing electrons, you can actually see images of the atom, the infinitesimally minute building block of our universe. If I were using that microscope right now, I still wouldn't be able to locate my interest in your problem.
And welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. I'm one of your hosts, Andy, and I'm here with my co-host, Anthony Baleful Strix Appreciator Maddox.
Why is that a title? Everybody appreciates this magic card.
No, some people don't, and you uniquely appreciate it, Anthony. I give you that nickname so we can make a quick reference to our end-of-the-year retrospective, which should be out as this episode is released, so you can go check it out on luckypaper.co. We reached out to a bunch of members of the Cube community and got their sort of favorite cards of the year, favorite set of the year, Cube level-up moment of the year, a couple other questions. And Anthony, you participated and said your card of the year was Baleful Strix, but specifically the one illustrated from the Ornithological Studies Secret Lair.
Yeah, I mean, there have been so many great Magic cards printed this year, but this particular classic just really gave me so much joy to put in my cube.
I do really like when Magic cards just have just normal stuff on them, you know? Like, I like the high fantasy and all, but I'll take just a card with a bird on it over a card with, like, fancy dragon on it or something, you know?
I mean, isn't a dragon just a fancy bird, though?
It is a fancy bird, that's true. It's like my favorite basics are all from the older era, not just because I have a preference for the old card frames, which you know, but also because the modern lands, they use it as a really, I think, great opportunity to kind of tell the story of the plane and, really establish a setting. And so I think modern basics are art directed to be very distinct from each other and from other sets. But I really just like when a mountain just looks like a ding-dang mountain, Nothing fancy. No weird floating, chunks of earth or strange structures. Just a mountain.
You're gonna make some enemies here. People love the Cup Island.
Yeah, I know people love Cup Island, but I like when the island just looks like a picture of a regular old island, and the plains is just like, here's some grass. That's my favorite era of basics. It's just, I feel like it brings the game. I like when the game, I feel like, is brought into my world as opposed to trying to create a new world for me to inhabit.
And you don't get closer than this Baleful Strix. I mean, this whole series of secret lairs, which this card we're talking about comes from, has definitely gotten a lot of attention that is not positive. But this really, to me, exemplifies like, oh yeah, when Magic design strays from sort of the straight and narrow, like what they expect and know works, not everything is going to be to your taste, but it means, that one or two things that is really up your alley is possible. And this illustration by Alan Douglas, which is only slightly better, if I'm honest, than the original, who is it, Nils Ham?
Yeah, the original's really good. I really like the original. They're both
really good, but it's just something special to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I always advocate for that, right? Like, people love to complain when someone prints a Magic card that they don't like the appearance of. I remember when the Kaladesh Inventions came out, which, to my memory, at least these are the first, like, really bold departure from Wizards of the Coast of, like, what a Magic card could look like in my history of playing the game, was the Kaladesh Inventions, which were followed up by the Invocations from Amonkhet, which were even more unreadable in their sort of treatment. And I wasn't a fan of either of those, to be honest, but I remember, like, I think it's very important to just, I like when they take risks and do wild things, and I think that attitude that led to the Inventions, which I don't love, and the Invocations, which I don't love, is the same attitude that eventually led to, like, for example, the Saga Frame, which I really, really love. I think sagas are gorgeous. And also like the adventure cards with the showcase frame, I think are really, really beautiful. We saw some of the Kaldheim spoilers already this past couple weeks, and I'm really excited for that showcase frame as well. I think it's beautiful. So I'm happy for them to take risks because every once in a while they'll do something I really like. And you know what? I don't have to get the ones I don't like. I don't have to get the Invocations or the showcase from Zendikar, which wasn't really to my taste either. I'll just stick with the ones I like.
What? You don't have to buy them all?
No, I am not that kind of collector whatsoever.
Yeah, I totally agree about the showcase frames in Kaldheim, and especially Eldraine. Those were actually the ones I really enjoyed in the first iteration of my cube, just trying to keep the frames uniform as much as possible. Sort of like that consistency, I think, actually helps emphasize the unique aspects of different cards. But I finally broke down for... what are the couple ones I have in there? The Fairy Guide Mother and Rimrock Knight and a couple of the other adventures that are just really, really excellent illustrations and excellent frame design.
Yeah, when Throne of Eldraine was out and we were still playing in paper, I remember if I had to fill in a gap for some trades at the local game store, I would always just happily trade for give me any foil showcase cards you have. I don't care what they are. Like Seeker Squire is just a beautiful showcase foil, and I don't plan on playing it in anything, I don't think, but I've got 3 or 4 foils just because they're beautiful, so good. I've got this Onslaught Plains in my hand right now, and it just looks like I was on a little hike this morning, and I was hiking through a field that looks exactly like this Onslaught Plains, Just, it is what it says on the card. It's just a plains. It's nothing fancy. That's my taste in Magic cards. So I agree with you. I like when they just put a bird on the card.
I will be, if you're going to force me to be a little bit critical, the owl does have ears, which I think is kind of the one thing about Stringies, is they're earless owls, but it is cuter with ears.
You are a nerd, and I'm telling you that on our Magic the Gathering podcast. So
and
may that land with all the weight that it deserves to. This episode is our last episode of the year, which is wild to say. We're also, I think it's our 27th episode. We've been doing this, Anthony, for half a year already, which doesn't feel real, but it is in fact half a year. And because it's holidays, a lot of people, I don't expect to get many new listeners to this episode because everyone's away from their computers and whatnot, not checking social media. So we are actually going to go through our backlog of listener-submitted Pack One Pick Ones and just do a bunch of them, 5 or 6 of this episode, see how many we get to, and use that as a jumping-off point to talk about any themes or ideas that come up in those packs. So that's the plan for this episode. Should we just dive in, Anthony? Is there any preamble you want to give here?
No, let's crack some packs.
Our first cube comes to us from listener Jason. Jason, thank you for submitting your cube. He said it was a sort of cube designed for a nostalgia of a specific era of Magic he played with his friends, and he built it specifically to try and get them back into Magic. I like a cube with a purpose, and getting your friends back into playing the game is a very good one, so I'm into that. It is a 600 card unpowered vintage cube, according to Cube Cobra, so it's got some vintage cards in there, and we're going to dive in and do our pack. I'm going to read it as always, and then Anthony's going to give us his sort of top contenders for the pack. We're always trying to make the Pack One Pick One segment a little bit easier to listen to. I know that, we have a combination of people that are very experienced and know all the cards inside and out, and for them, us reading the card text is kind of annoying. I also know we have listeners that might not know all of these cards, and then following the pack on an audio format can be difficult. So what we're going to do this time is I'm going to read all the cards, just the card titles, and then any card that's in contention for us, we're going to read the rules text if it is, a card we're considering taking from the pack. So the pack is Blood-Forged Battle Axe, Sheoldred the Whispering One, Scrubland, Elspeth Conquers Death, Sword of Light and Shadow, Talrind Sky Summoner, Worf Infiltrator, Ashiok Dream Render, Zealous Conscripts, Liliana Heretical Healer, Collected Company, Niv Mizzet Perun, Teferi Hero of Dominaria, Chromatic Lantern, and Hope of Girapur. I feel like those were a lot of long Magic names. I think those cards all had kind of long titles. But Anthony, what are the cards that jump out at you from this pack of Jason's 600-card unpowered vintage cube designed to get his friends back into playing Magic with him?
Well, first of all, I like you said, love a cube with a goal, and that's a pretty solid goal. But hard to tell what exactly do your friends love about Magic, and what are the cards that are really going to spark their attention? I don't know. For me, though, I think this is a pretty easy pick of Elspeth Conquers Death. Similarly, in terms of power level, Teferi and Niv Mizzet are very strong. The swords are all quite strong, but I think Elspeth Conquers Death is just a really easy, incredibly powerful card that doesn't need a lot of work to make work.
Yeah, so Elspeth Conquers Death is a saga. It's 3 and 2 white, and the first chapter is exile target permanent and opponent controls with converted mana cost 3 or greater. The second chapter is non-creature spells your opponents cast cost 2 more to cast until your next turn. And the third chapter is return target creature or planeswalker card from your graveyard to the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on it or a loyalty counter on it. So this is, I am always reminded of the Elder, what's the black one from Dominaria, the saga?
Phyrexian Scriptures?
No, the 5 mana uncommon one.
Oh, the Eldest Reborn.
Thank you. I'm always reminded of the Eldest Reborn in that this is a 5 mana saga that messes with your opponent's stuff, and then at the end you cash it in for a card. So definitely a lot of value for 5 mana there. You know, you're going to exile something, you're going to make it difficult for them to cast spells, giving you hopefully a little bit of a tempo advantage, and then you're going to get a whole card back for your Elspeth Conquers Death, hopefully a good card at the stage at which you're casting this in the game. I've heard this card is very good. I don't think I've ever actually cubed with it, and I am not going to take it here. My concerns about it are that the exiling something that opponent controls with only converted mana cost 3 or greater, I think could be a pretty big liability, specifically against aggro. Whether or not they even have a target seems not like a guaranteed thing there. And I do not want to be casting this card in a matchup where it does not reliably have a target. And at 5 mana, it does generate a lot of value, but I expect in a cube of this power level, based on the cards I'm looking at in this pack, there'll be a lot of ways to generate a lot of value at 5 mana. Teferi Hero of Dominaria being another great example. So out of this pack, I think I'm just going to take the Scrub land, which is, the white-black original dual land, because none of these cards are really speaking to me. The 4 colorless cards are the Bloodforged Battle Axe, the Sword of Light and Shadow, the Chromatic Lantern, and the Hope of Girapur. Bloodforged Battle Axe is kind of it's basically, I think, a slightly worse Bone Splitter with upside, where you can potentially, has a very high ceiling of making copies of itself whenever it hits an opponent, but for the most part, it's a Bone Splitter that costs an additional 1 to equip, which is still a fine equipment. I'd be happy enough to put that in any aggro deck. Sword of Light and Shadow is one of the sword cycle with the protection from 2 colors, and I'm not very high on those either, just because it is a whole 5 mana investment before you get to get any value off that card, and it's a pretty easy in an environment with a lot of removal for your opponent to just stifle your first or even your second equip of that sword, and then you've just dumped so much mana into this thing before you get anything back, which is kind of rough. I'm not very high on 3 mana rocks like Chromatic Lantern, and Hope of Girapur is like a kind of colorless aggro card, I'm assuming. Potentially some weird combo things going on there, but none of the colorless cards are really speaking to me, and then none of these colored spells are strong enough to pull me into committing sort of pack one, pick one. So I'm just going to take that Scrubland, I think.
Wow.
Do you find that to be a hot take?
I don't think that's a hot take. I mean, I think it's pretty easy to say, well, start with fixing, it's good. Nobody's going to really criticize you for that, and I'll be among people not criticizing you for it. But I do think your evaluation of Elspeth Conquers Death is a little low.
Have you played with this in a cube?
Great question.
I was not trying to be clear, I was not trying to shame you there and insist that you can't rate it highly unless you've played with it. I just didn't know if you had or not.
I think I have seen it a couple times across the table in the Arena Cube. Hopefully it's on the list, or I will look like the idiot.
I believe it is in the Arena Cube, and I think it's probably very good there, for example, in that environment, I would expect.
I think it might also be in the MTGO Vintage Cube. I
think it is as well, yeah. I know that this is a card that, like LSV, for example, your arch nemesis, is quite high on in the Vintage Cube, and thinks it's a great inclusion. Though I will note, at time of recording, LSV is having a kind of rough run in his Vintage Cube trophy contest, and I don't think he's gotten a single trophy yet. I think he's 0 for 6 or something as we record this. So,
wow, that really makes his opinion on this card invalid.
Exactly. Let's just completely invalidate all of his years of incredible Magic experience and great performance in myriad formats with six bad luck in a row. Then you're just back to square one, I think.
I do really enjoy some of the cards in this pack, though. Like Bloodforged Battle Axe, which you mentioned, is something that whenever I see, I'm like, ooh, that's really exciting. The fact that, every time you actually get to hit with it, you start making tokens of this axe is really exciting. That being said, I don't know if I've ever actually seen it in play, but I'd like to someday. Maybe it's worth just throwing in my cube and seeing how it works.
Yeah, I think it's probably an appropriate power level for your cube. I always find in my aggressive decks that, first of all, I only want to run 1 to 3 equipment or vehicles, period, because it's so awful when you like draw all of your equipment or all your vehicles and have so few creatures to equip them to, and then you get, one or two removal spells or something, or trades in combat, and pretty soon like you've just kind of 2-for-1'd yourself, because now the equipment is also not doing anything. It's effectively removed from the game.
Right.
So I just never find myself at a shortage of things to equip my equipment to. And so if you did get multiple copies of this, that would be great. But then, 2 mana to equip each copy is kind of steep.
Yeah, that's the real limiting factor, is even if you feel like, wow, I'm going off. Because, the copies have the same effect. So if you have 2 X's on someone, you end up with 4. But because you have to equip each of them, it does sort of limit how much it can actually snowball, which is probably good, honestly, for the kind of gameplay it's going to create.
Right.
I wonder if there's a space that's more, if you're actually sacrificing artifacts and using it just as a repeatable way to generate artifact tokens could be interesting.
Yeah, it's a cool thought. Yeah, I could see that being something. You have like a red-black Duretti, and you hit them with some dinky flyer carrying a Bloodforged battle axe, make a copy of the axe, sacrifice it to remove something. It sounds like pretty gross.
I'm into that.
Thank you, Jason, for sending in your pack. I'm sorry it took us so long to get to it. This is one of the earliest submissions we got, but, we're always trying to triage things here and do the appropriate pack at the appropriate time. But we're very grateful for you for sending it in. Let's go on to our next cube. Anthony, what do you think?
I'm looking at this cube, and I see that Fairy Guide Mother art we were just talking about.
Oh, I do want to mention that Elspeth Conquers Death is a beautiful Magic card.
Oh my god.
We were talking about how pretty the Saga frames are. The art on this card is incredible. The frame looks great. It's just beautiful. Also has a nice, some of the sagas don't look great because certain chapters have much less rules text than others. This is getting very extremely shallow and aesthetic here. But, the ones that have some really short chapters and really long chapters, it's kind of like, it's not really balanced. But this one's got, 4 lines, or 5 lines, 4 lines, 6 lines for the chapters. It's a nice little pattern. It's good. Beautiful card. Love to see it.
Yeah, I mean, talking about bringing in cards that represent things in our own life, the fact that the sagas sort of as the way they're designed all together get to actually be representations of different art forms, just sort of in a really subtle way that I think totally feels in the aesthetic of Magic, lets the artists that are making all this wonderful artwork do something like a little bit unique, or very unique and beautiful.
Yeah, the fact that they had the kind of tapestry art direction for all of the sagas was, I think, a stroke of brilliance, because you're right, it allows the artist to adopt a specific style that might otherwise feel like it doesn't comport with the typical, well-rendered high fantasy style of modern Magic art, but no, they're all supposed to be, embroideries, so there's room to actually embrace a different style. So
not just tapestries and embroideries, like the Elspeth Conquers Death is a mosaic, and the Phyrexian Scriptures, this is imagination of an art form that the Phyrexians create. And there's even one, the first Rowan Games, is like an ancient Greek terracotta pottery painting, which is really interesting.
Yeah. Our next cube is a Pauper Cube that comes to us from Sir Magic Toast. Thank you, Sir Magic Toast, for sending in your Pauper Cube. I'm just going to read the pack. So, the pack is Miming Slime, Cogwork Librarian, Mana Geode, Blightning, Grasping Thrall, Baloth Gorger, Mother Bear, Scorched Rosalka, Hooting Mandrills, Stab Wound, Bloodshed Fever, Segovian Angel, Thraben Inspector, Prey Upon, and Hunter's Edge. No lands in this pack, Anthony, so that can't just, cop out and take a land. So what are you looking at here?
So the conventional wisdom, I think maybe you'll agree with, for drafting Peasant and Pauper Cubes, is you often just want to go for the 2-for-1s. Like, you're much less likely to find these sort of engines that generate a lot of card advantage, and it's also harder to make extremely aggressive decks. So looking for those 2-for-1s is usually a good place to start. This particular pack doesn't offer us a lot in that particular area. Basically, our options would be
What are you talking about?
Inspector
Blightning's right there.
And Blightning. Yeah, we got those two. But I don't think I want to start on a gold card. So I'm leaning towards Thraben Inspector, but I actually think that my pick is going to be Cogwork Librarian.
Yeah, let's read these cards. So we mentioned Blightning briefly. That's 1 black-red for a sorcery that deals 3 damage to target player and makes them discard 2 cards. So kind of a... What's the canonical opponent discards 2 cards for 2 and a black card?
I always use Mind Rot. Is that not the...
I think that's
right
what
one?
it is. So this is a Mind Rot with the sort of addition of red mana to also bolt them, which is a little bit of an edge there.
There must be a card called Blight, right? Or something like that?
It's possible.
For this name to make
I'm sure
sense.
there's many cards called Blight something. This is Magic we're talking about. The Thraben Inspector is just a single white mana for a 1/2 that when it enters the battlefield, you investigate, which is you get a clue token, which a clue token is an artifact that you can pay to and sacrifice to draw a card. So that's a great little staple for pretty much any deck. Just, a 1/2 that replaces itself is pretty valuable in most environments. But I agree with you 100%, Anthony. I'm taking Clockwork Librarian. This is a 4-mana 3/3 artifact creature construct, which is not the relevant text. The relevant text is that you draft a Clockwork Librarian face up, and as you draft a card, you may draft an additional card from that booster pack. If you do, put Clockwork Librarian back into that booster pack. So basically, you buy yourself a pick for later. And we've talked about Clockwork Librarian specifically on the show before, have we not?
I think we have. I mean, we must have. It's one of my favorite cards for draft.
Well, if I remember, I think we had this conversation where you and I maybe disagreed a little bit on the evaluation, which is that I, in that particular cube, was very high on Clockwork Librarian and said I would take it pack one, pick one over almost anything because what it gives you is this, additional value later where you can, take the 2 best cards out of a later pack if you want to. And you push back a little bit and basically pointed out that if you're taking pack one, pick one, you're already giving up one of your first picks, right? One of your highest value picks where you have the most options available. And so it might not be as good as I expect, but I'm still very high on it. Here I'm going to take it. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine taking anything in this cube over Clockwork Librarian, pack one, pick one, I think, because what I really want to do is get into a lane in like the second pack or something, and then third pack, in the first couple picks, cash in that Clockwork Librarian for a pack that has really good cards for my deck, and with the additional information I have of what colors I'm in, be able to commit hard, because this pack has some good cards in it, right? Like, some of these cards are very strong. It's a question of like, am I really going to first pick some card that is going to commit me to a certain type of deck when I don't know what's going to be passed to me later on? And instead, I'd rather just take this Clockwork Librarian and push that decision and the sort of value of that decision off to later in the draft.
Yeah, in this context, I'll agree with that. I wouldn't take it over something that I think is a really strong signal for a particular archetype that, would make me excited to take it pack one, pick one, and jump into something. But here, all these cards are at a pretty even power level. I'd be pretty happy to end up with any of those in my deck, so I think there's a lot of value to just staying open for a couple of picks. And it can really, really pay off to be able to basically get 2 picks in the color you're actually going to end up later in the game. And
to your comment, we have talked before about how environments that are lower power sometimes lean heavily towards the value end of the spectrum. And you mentioned that is often your approach to a pauper cube, is like take the 2-for-1s, just try and outvalue my opponent. That's the axis on which I'm going to win the game. And I often think that's true, but I don't actually think it's true because aggro is harder to draft per se. I think aggro can be very well supported in pauper and peasant environments and other low power environments. I think the thing that really feels more different is that there is not the sort of typical control deck, right? Because you don't get board wipes, which is, I think, a really important element of control at higher power levels. You also don't get, even at Peasant, the kinds of planeswalkers that can uptick and take over a whole game. And so if you're going to be in any non-aggressive strategy, you are going to be competing on this card equity 2-for-1 basis. You're not going to be able to just say, all right, let my opponent flood the board and then I'll get them with a 5-for-1 with my Wrath of God or whatever. That's not on the table for you. You have to have this incremental value. Whereas at higher power levels, you can just play the card selection game where maybe you're not even getting 2-for-1s. You're just going 1-for-1 with your little cantrips. You go 1-for-1 with counter magic and spot removal because eventually you can either resolve some planeswalker, which is going to generate immense value, or you can wipe the board and get a 4 or 5-for-1 in one shot. And given that you can't do that in these environments, you have to really play that value game in these sort of mid-range, and even the more controlling slow decks have to play kind of the grindy game because they're not going to be able to generate those huge swings with single cards.
For sure, yeah. I think that the next thing for me, honestly, so Lightning I'm not super into just because it's a gold card, and I think it's going to be important to stay open and figure out what we're drafting here. So behind those other 2 cards, I actually think I like Hooting Mandrills, which is just a 4/4 with Delve and Trample. It's just a pretty great late-game finisher that you can end up playing much too early.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I would love to say that I could take... The card that is calling my name is Thraben Inspector because I do love how flexible it is, but a mistake I often make in lower-powered environments is just underrating things like a 4/4 with Trample, which, to your point, here, having a 4/4 with Trample will often just win you the game, where, I think I've spent more time drafting higher-powered cubes where a 4/4 with Trample is kind of whatever. Definitely not going to just like close the game out. But here, I do think that could be, the difference between winning and not winning. And the sort of little value you get from 3-bit Inspector is maybe less relevant here because you just want to be playing 4/4s.
I love playing a 4/4 personally.
I still have a vivid memory of when we first started playing in Magic again, years ago. We were building our little like weird kitchen table decks, and we were slowly kind of creeping up in power level. And I remember that our friend Day, I think, was playing online a little bit, and they were playing lower powered environments, and they were just like, you know what? I had a game where I got a 4/4, and I was like, 4/4s are great. This is awesome. Like, this card is so good. It's a 4/4. I get to slowly attack them. And he was basically just kind of reveling in the joys of lower powered Magic when we were starting to creep up a little bit, and we were playing more cheap interaction. We were playing, snowballing threats, and he was like, you know what's cool? Winning with a 4/4. I like that.
Same.
All right, thank you, Sir Magic Toast, for sending in that pauper list. All these lists and will be linked in the show notes, of course, so everyone can go check out these cube lists for themselves. This one was also sent to us a while ago, and I noticed that the title on Cube Cobra does have this cube labeled old in parentheses, so I hope this list is not so outdated that the Pack One Pick One is not worth it to you anymore, Sir Magic Toast. If it is, send in your new list. We'll do that one sometime in the future as well. This next cube comes to us from listener Brimlock. It's a 360 card vintage cube, and the goal of this environment is to have fair decks at a higher than usual power level. So perhaps something kind of like my cube, where we're playing high-powered fair, but we're not doing combo stuff or storm or anything like that. Something in that range we can maybe expect. The pack is Treasure Cruise, Glint Sleeve Siphoner, Grafted Wargear, Serum Visions, Imposing Sovereign, Terramander, Condescend, Prophet of Krufix, Bayou, Supreme Will, Kitesail Freebooter, Knight of the Eben Legion, Fire Prophecy, Hangerback Walker, and Light Up the Stage.
This is exhausting. So just to review, so far we've got Elspeth Conquers Death, and we've drafted a Cogwork Librarian, so we get 2 picks, right? Is that how this works?
Yeah. We should just call this episode, listener submitted chaos draft. Yeah,
this is the Chaos Supreme draft.
Chaos Supreme draft. We're mixing everyone's cubes together, and we're going to draft one deck from them. So yeah, I guess we're kind of in white, but we have some, some colors to pick later.
So this particular pack just has like so many of the highest powered cards for different strategies. I think it's very much just sort of dealer's choice. I think I would be between Treasure Cruise if I was going to take a blue card, Grafted Wargear if I wanted to be aggro, or Knight of the Eben Legion. How do those sound to you?
Let's read them first. So Treasure Cruise is 7 and a blue for a sorcery that says draw 3 cards, but of course it has Delve, so you don't often pay more than a few mana for it, which is great. Grafted Wargear is 3 mana for an equipment, artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +3/+2. When Grafted Wargear becomes unattached from that creature, sacrifice that creature, and it has equip 0, very importantly, so you just get to equip that for free. And then you mentioned Knight of the Eben Legion, which is a 1-drop in black. It's a 1/2 that has an activated ability, 2 in a black. Knight of the Eben Legion gets +3/+3 and gains Death Touch until end of turn. And there's still more text on it. At the beginning of your end step, if a player lost 4 or more life this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Knight of the Eben Legion. So the sort of obvious thing that happens with Knight of the Eben Legion is if you pump it and attack and damage your opponent with the knight itself, it gets bigger, though of course there are other ways for your opponent or even you to lose 4 life during your turn such that you can continue to pump the Knight of the Eben Legion.
I mean, the most fun thing about Knight of the Eben Legion is so often you just don't activate it. It's a 1-drop that basically has unblockable and then grows later in the game.
Threat of activation is very real, and a relatively recent level up moment for me in my gameplay was when you're looking at how you want to spend your mana. You're like, all right, well, if I attack with my Knight of the Eben Legion, no one's going to block because they don't want to, turn its activated ability into a free removal spell. So they just let it hit them for 1, and then you have the choice of, am I going to spend my turn just pumping mana into my knight, or am I going to actually cast a spell from my hand? And I feel like the level 1 of that is like, well, you always cast a spell, obviously, right? Because the spell in your hand is almost certainly going to have a bigger impact on the game than just paying 3 mana to pump the knight temporarily and give it a +1/+1 counter at the end on the end step. But the sort of second level of this, which is the sort of level up moment I had maybe in the past couple years, is that sometimes you really would rather just dump mana into your onboard threats because it doesn't cost you cards from hand, right? So, for example, if I'm playing against an opponent that is either in colors that I would expect to see a board wipe, or maybe I've already seen a board wipe from them in the first game, I'd be very keen to just spend my mana on the Knight of the Ebon Legion, make it a little more powerful, keep the threat growing and snowballing a little bit, and force them to answer it before I start spending resources on other cards. Whereas in other matchups, I might decide I actually is more important that I get full value out of my mana here, and I'm not worried about this sort of late game 2-for-1 where I play more cards out and they get answered by a board wipe or something. I actually feel like I learned this lesson from watching Ben Stark draft with one of your favorite cards, Slimefoot. And I remember watching him play these games with a Slimefoot deck he drafted, and just being surprised at how many times I was like, okay, well, Ben's obviously going to cast this card now. Or Ben was like, no, screw that. Just making Saprolik tokens. I'm just dumping mana into Slimefoot, even though using that mana to cast a spell is much more impactful. If he just sits there and keeps dumping mana into Slimefoot, if they eventually answer the Slimefoot, then he's got a handful of cards to continue to sort of pressure their opponent.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the sort of the heuristic or the recommendation, just try and use all of your mana every turn. So, if you're looking at, you have 6 mana and you have a 5-drop and a 6-drop, even if the 5-drop would be more impactful in the current board state, casting the more expensive spell so you actually use all your mana maybe sets you up to actually be able to double spell the next turn. And I feel like that's a similar principle here. Would you agree?
Yeah, but the heuristic is like, using your mana on a card in hand is always going to be more impactful, and that's part of the reason why you want to use your mana every turn is you want to max out. And so the heuristic of keep curving out, keep casting your spells holds up until you have this choice of well, actually I could just use that mana for this less impactful ability, but there's lots of times where that actually makes sense. Another good example of this, I really love the level up style aggro 1-drops, so your Figures of Destiny, your Students of Warfare, those kinds of cards. Because they give you a very similar choice, right? I play my Student of Warfare on 1. The next turn, maybe I cast a 2-drop, maybe I just double pump the Student of Warfare, and I think that's a very interesting decision to give your players at that state of the game, where they want to ask themselves, is it more important that I turn this into a real threat, or that I put on a little more pressure by diversifying my threats and playing more to the board? I think it's just an interesting decision point, in addition to those cards being great because they're actually 1-drops that you're not unhappy to draw really late in the game. While watching a draft of my cube this week, saw somebody that was in a super stalled out board with their white aggro deck, and they just drew Figure of Destiny and were like, all right, now I have an 8/8 flyer, so deal with that.
That was a weird game.
Yeah, because their opponent did in fact deal with it, so it was a weird game for sure.
The last sort of mini game with Knight of the Ebon Legion is sometimes, it's late in the game, you have 6 mana and your opponent's at a low life total, and they're actually just forced to block, and then you don't have to pump it, so you end up just getting to eat through their cheap creatures without ever having to actually dump mana into it.
Yeah, this card has really impressed me in black aggro. I think it's pretty quickly become my highest rated aggro 1-drop creature in black, which is not nothing. There's some pretty good ones there. But yeah, all those abilities just really add up. And then those other scaling 1-drops, drawing this on turn 6 or something, if you can untap and have the mana to double pump it, it's a serious threat. That could get hit for 7 by your 1-drop. That's really something.
You know that when a 1-drop is really, really impactful and limited, you've got something special.
So out of this pack, Anthony, I am taking Grafted War Gear, and I don't think it's particularly close. I mean, I agree with you. There's a lot of good cards here, and you're not going to be... It's not like you're train wrecking your draft by taking Treasure Cruise or Hangerback Walker or something. But I rate War Gear really, really highly, not just in aggro, though especially in aggro, but I also like it in mid-range decks. Or even a tempo deck, putting it on a cheap flyer and just turning it into a huge threat, I think is very reasonable. The downside of this card, that if it becomes unattached, you have to sacrifice the creature, is a very slim downside. It really only comes up if your opponent has a bounce spell for the Grafted War Gear, which does feel pretty bad. But under normal circumstances, you're mostly just not going to care to move the equipment around once you attach it to something. And it basically becomes, a 3-mana, 3/2 with haste that also gets all the abilities of whatever card it has, your tramples, your lifelinks, your flying. So quite an impactful card. My second pick is probably Treasure Cruise, which is kind of broken. It's a really good card, turns out.
Both really good cards.
I will give a shout out here to Hangerback Walker. I think Hangerback Walker does not get the credit it deserves. This is an artifact creature. It costs XX, and it comes into play with X +1/+1 counters on it. So if you pay 2 mana for it, it comes in as a 1/1. And then when it dies, you create a 1/1 Thopter token for each counter on it. And then it also has the ability, pay 1 and tap it to put an additional counter on Hangerback Walker. I think this card because it's a scalable card that, again, is not going to be best in class at any slot. Like, it's not the best 2-drop, it's not the best 4-drop, it's not the best 6-drop. It's kind of a little bit behind the curve no matter what. I think people tend to maybe overlook it, but that card is not far behind Treasure Cruise for me in my sort of pick order here. Go War Gear, Treasure Cruise, then probably Hangerback Walker, then maybe the Bayou. Just because it does go in almost any deck. I mean, even control decks are pretty happy to have a Hangerback Walker because it's a perfectly serviceable 2-drop if you're trying to just slow down aggro, right? It either chump blocks twice or very oftentimes will trade with a creature or two if it has 1 toughness, because you make, 2 1/1s for 2 mana basically, which is very good. I was playing against Perilous Mirror in your cube the other week and got stifled a couple times in my aggro deck where I was just like, dang, the Perilous Mirror is pretty good against me. It's going to block one of my creatures and then die and then kill another creature. That's pretty good. So I think Hangerback Walker gets a little bit underrated. Also great just to pass the turn, hold it up, make it a little bigger if you don't have to spend your mana on a counterspell or something. So I think a card's good.
Yeah, it can be really helpful just to try and reframe cards in terms of other cards that you know. And if I look at this and just say, well, it's actually just a Steel Overseer with upside, I'm kind of into that. Obviously, Steel Overseer works better if you have other artifact creatures, but in a lot of decks it ends up in lower powered environments just being a fine card on its own. I do want to also, if I can have some shoutouts, point out the 2 red cards here. Light Up the Stage, which it has a lot of text, but let's just say it's Divination for 1 in red. 1 red mana, draw 2 cards is basically what it boils down to. And I think you're pretty low on this card, but casting this in an aggressive deck and just without having to really lose much of your tempo by spending mana on a draw spell is really, really potent.
I'm not actually that low on Light Up the Stage. I think it's a great card. I cut it from my cube only because I felt like there was only so many slots I could have for cards in my aggro deck that didn't kill my opponent. And Light Up the Stage is great. I mean, it's card advantage for 1 mana, like you said. It's a very powerful 2-for-1. But the fact that it doesn't actually kill your opponent means it takes up one of those, what I consider to be very precious slots of like a card that you can put in your aggro deck that's not going to actually do the work of killing your opponent. I think I might actually go back to it, though, just because the card I kept in over, I believe at the time, was Experimental Frenzy, and I kept it in because that is, I think, in some ways a much more interesting and fun card because you do get to sometimes like totally go off once you reach that part of your library, and I've since cut that card as well. I could see going back to Light Up the Stage because, like you said, being able to do this for 1 mana and also still play your 2-drop on turn 3 or whatever is feels really good.
Yeah, it's pretty nuts. I also really love Fire Prophecy. I think that just based on, quick glance through the list and looking at the other cards in this pack, Fire Prophecy is probably a little below power level here, so I probably would expect it to be a pretty late pick and maybe not make my deck. But I really, really love how this card plays. It's 2 mana to deal 3 damage to... Is it only to a creature? Only to a creature. And then you basically cycle a card, but you put it on the bottom of your library instead of your graveyard. And that play pattern is just awesome. The only downside is when your opponent has a combat trick or something and can fizzle your Fire Prophecy and you don't get the cycle that you thought was really critical to making your hand work.
Yeah, I like this card a lot. This card is like 1 line of rules text away from being something I would very happily cube. If it could also hit Planeswalkers or, I mean, obviously also hitting players would be huge, but the big cost to me is that a lot of my red decks are aggressive. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And to have this card in your aggressive deck can be a liability when you're playing against control. Because if they don't play a creature, if they just, go Signet into the Planeswalker or, board up into Planeswalker, then you're just kind of stuck with a whole dead card that you can't do anything with, which is really rough. Like, even if it had like the ability to maybe deal 1 damage to a player or 3 damage to, a creature and then still had that cycling ability, I would be pretty excited to play it because getting rid of dead cards in the late game and drawing more stuff is really powerful, but just so close.
And the biggest drawback is the illustration is decidedly not to my taste.
Oh, I think it's fine. It's just a big flaming eye.
Just a big flaming eye. Who needs that?
It's a little cheeseball, but I do like how simple it is.
Nah.
Anyway, thank you, Brimlock, for sending in your cube list. It's a pretty good-looking 360-card vintage cube. A lot of the cards in that pack are cards I also include in my own list and like very much. Next up, we have another 360-card cube. This one is a legacy cube that comes to us from Dave, a.k.a. Woplord. Thank you, Dave. And this is another sort of fair, high-powered environment designed with an inexperienced play group somewhat in mind, is what we got here. This pack is Charming Prince, Serum Visions, Wolf Willow Haven, Dread Wanderer, Frantic Search, Young Pyromancer, Dream Eater, Elspeth Conquers Death, Kiora Behemoth Beckoner, Dream Trawler, Baleful Strix, Garruk Wild Speaker, Rampant Growth, Rishkar, Pima Renegade, and Razor Verge Thicket. Anthony, a lot of cards we just talked about. We got Baleful Strix, we got Elspeth Conquers Death, we had a Serum Visions in the previous pack, it's also in this pack. What are you looking at here?
I think we should cash in our Cogwork Librarian, take Elspeth Conquers Death and Dream Trawler, and cross our fingers.
Yeah, just to clarify, we aren't actually drafting these. We are doing pack one, pick ones here. I just don't want anyone to get confused. We are not actually imagining we're doing one draft with all these packs, but I like the idea, Anthony, of us being able to end up with both Elspeth Conquers Death and Dream Trawler. Maybe we could wheel that Trawler. Maybe. I don't know. People seem to take it pretty highly, even if they're not already committed to blue-white. But what are you actually taking?
So the things that stand out to me are Elspeth Conquers Death, for all the reasons we've talked about, and that might be my pick. Garruk Wildspeaker is close for me. Honestly, I don't think it quite gets there, and then legitimately Dream Trawler is kind of an absurd Magic card. To be honest, if I, take off my player hat and put my designer hat on, I think this card is terrible. I don't enjoy playing against it, I don't enjoy playing with it. It's not good Magic to me. But putting on my player hat again, it's insane. Of course I want this in my deck. It's unbeatable.
As a designer, I have a problem with how insusceptible this card is and how the entire game revolves around its resolution. As a player, me want win! Me want win game Magic! Kill opponent dead!
It's not only a gold card, it's a double pip gold card, which makes it really hard to splash, but this card's just absurd.
Yeah, Dream Trawler is 2 white, blue, 6 mana total for a creature Sphinx. It is a 3/5 with flying and lifelink. And whenever you draw a card, Dream Trawler gets +1/+0 until end of turn, so it's really a 4/5 on your turn. And then whenever Dream Trawler attacks, you draw another card, so it basically attacks as a 5/5 with flying and lifelink. And then you can discard a card to give it hexproof until end of turn and tap it, which means your opponents really can't, under most circumstances, remove it, though they can continue to spend spells to force you to tap it down and discard cards from your hand, which is really one of the only ways you can win against this card in any kind of fair environment once it resolves, is really out-tempo them by turning your removal spells into tap spells that make them discard cards, but it can really kind of carry a whole game on its own.
Yeah, I mean, what do you want from a Magic card? Do you want it to be invincible? Sure. Do you want it to draw you a million cards? Cool. Do you want it to gain you a tremendous amount of life? Okay.
It does all the things.
Am I being way too high on it, though? I haven't honestly played with it that much in different kinds of cubes.
I don't think you are. It's so here's a couple things about Dream Trawler. I have considered this card for the Degenerate Micro Cube, which might sound wild, but discard outlets are very good in that environment. So the discard a card to give it hexproof and tap it not only will allow you to protect your Dream Trawler, but also allows you to, for example, discard your Eldrazi Titan and shuffle your entire graveyard into your library at your whim whenever you want, in a way that's very hard to interact with. And it's a totally reasonable Reanimator target because it doesn't die to anything and eats the removal spells and will just gain you life and eventually win you the game. So I think it's very, very strong, both in Reanimator and also just in a control deck where you cast it, honestly. So, yeah, I don't think you're being too high on it. I think it's very good. It is very committal. I mean, white, blue, unless you're reanimating it, is pretty committal. I'm not sure if Reanimator is in this cube. I guess I see Frantic Search, which is kind of a clue that I would maybe expect to see Reanimator in this list, because I'm not many situations outside of Storm or Reanimator where I want to play Frantic Search. Let's see here. Yeah, we have what looks like a couple of the reanimation spells at the 4-mana slot. So we have Zombify, we have Eldest Reborn, we talked about Elspeth Conquers Death. So it looks like we have some kind of Reanimator stuff here, but not fast Reanimator. I don't see the 1 or 2 mana ways to put a creature into play from the graveyard. So yeah, you could take that and still end up being a Reanimator list instead of a white blue control list, but I don't think you're too high on it. I think it stands out of this pack. I think it's very strong. You also mentioned Garruk Wildspeaker, the original green Planeswalker. He's 2 green for a Planeswalker Garruk. Comes in with 3 loyalty. You add a loyalty to untap 2 target lands, or you may remove a loyalty counter to put a 3/3 beast token into play, or you can remove 4 loyalty counters to give yourself an overrun. Creatures you control get +3/+3 and gain trample until end of turn. You know, what the original green Planeswalker, and still, I think, one of the best and cleanest, nicest designs. The fact that you can use it as a sort of tempo thing where you play it and then in the same turn play another 2-drop is very potent. Just down-ticking it 3 times to get 3 beasts is a really great use of your 4 mana. And, you know, the common pattern of uptick and then next turn overrun is also a great line. So I do love Garruk Wildspeaker. I gotta say though, Anthony, out of this pack, I am taking a card you did not mention. I'm just gonna take Young Pyromancer here.
That's fair. You're certainly not going to end up putting the player to your left in red.
Yeah, exactly. I'm cutting red, exactly. No, so that's 1 in a red for a 2/1 human shaman, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you create a 1/1 red elemental creature token. So this is a bit of a build around. You are not going to be thrilled to play this in any red deck, and while it sometimes makes the list, I find, in like an aggressive mono red deck, it is far from a strong card in that list. It ends up being, maybe the 23rd or 24th playable in a just pure mono red aggro deck. Where you really want to play this is in some kind of spell slingery, tempo-y deck, usually blue-red in my experience, where you have a bunch of cantrips like Serum Visions or Frantic Surge, for example. Not that Frantic Surge is a cantrip, but it's a cheap card selection spell. And you just basically turn your 2-drop into an army of threats that can take over the game. So it's a bit of a build around, and, it's probably not as safe a pick as something like Garruk or Elspeth Conquers Death, which are the 2 next cards that jump out at me out of this pack. I think Rampant Growth is also fine, and Razor Verge Thicket is also fine, but I think I'm on Pyromancer here, and I'm going to hope to draft maybe a more focused deck and get those triggers.
I think that's defensible and also a ton of fun.
It is one of my favorite cards, too. I will say this, though. I would love to get a reprint of Young Pyromancer with different art, please. Something about this art does not work for me. I don't like it.
It's not my favorite either.
I have my fingers crossed that we are getting some reprints next year in the Time Spiral Remastered that are going to be reprinted in an old frame specifically. And as an iconic card in multiple constructed formats and a beloved card across the board, I would love to see an old frame Young Pyromancer with some maybe throwback style art. That would be a true gift.
What do you think about Kiora Behemoth Beckoner? So it's basically a 3-mana planeswalker that basically gives you an extra mana every turn. Or it is untapped target permanent, so it has a little bit of flexibility, but it also draws you a card whenever you cast a big creature.
This was one of the uncommon planeswalkers from War of the Spark that I was initially excited to play in my cube, and I put one in at the sort of launch of War of the Spark and played it for a little bit. And it never did quite what I wanted. Like you said, the baseline seems quite fine, because it's kind of like very difficult to interact with Mana Dork. I mean, they can attack it. It comes in at 7 loyalty, so it'd be pretty wild to decide you're going to attack down the Kiora Behemoth Beckoner and not just kill your opponent if you can get through with 7 power. But, so it gives you a mana every turn, pretty much, as a baseline. Might untap something of a higher value. And then that potential to also draw cards also seems very potent. And what I found is that it really might as well not be a hybrid card. It might as well just be a mono green card, because you are not happy to put this in a blue list or a blue something list unless you have a bunch of ways to trigger that draw a card thing, which in my cube at least I didn't in blue, and really don't anywhere outside of green am I putting creatures that big into play. And then even if you were in a mostly green list or something, it was just so much of a lower priority than the cheaper mana acceleration and then the sort of premium threats. And once you get to 3 mana, I'd rather have an actual threat like a Tireless Tracker or something, a Nissa, Voice of Zendikar, one of those kinds of cards, than this Kiora Behemoth Beckoner, which maybe threatens to draw some cards and ramps you a little bit, but it just was really not impactful at that slot, for me at least. So I'm not super high on it, but there's certainly environments where it could do quite a bit of work. A slower environment that was more value focused, that did actually have more creatures that were that big. The other thing I found, honestly, which sounds kind of weird to say this, but I actually have very few creatures in green even that enter the battlefield with 4 or greater power. I have a lot of things at 5 mana that are planeswalkers that make 3/3 tokens. I have stuff like Wolfbriar Elemental, which is 1/4/4, but then a bunch of other tokens. Like, there's not that many ways to draw cards from it in my cube.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, the environment you described is kind of exactly my cube, and I recently ended up actually cutting it just because it was... the floor was pretty low. Sometimes it would just be a card that wouldn't do anything, but when you started going off and your opponent's just, playing a bunch of 6-drops and your removal feels horrible because they're just drawing new cards to replace those cards, really led to some not great gameplay.
Yeah, I'd rather play something, honestly, like the Guardian Project or Lifecrafter's Bestiary in that slot, if you wanted, like, a green-centered, value-generating, non-creature permanent. Those are the things I'd rather play in that slot. But I'm not playing any of those either, so I'm not very high on that effect.
Fair enough.
Let's do one more cube, Anthony. Thank you, Wop Lord, for sending in that cube, and we're going to end the episode with Joe, a.k.a. Fiend's Peasant Cube. So this is, of course, Peasant, which, Anthony, which one is it?
I'm cheating. I'm looking at the pack. It's commons and uncommons.
Okay, yes. Peasant is uncommons and below. Anthony does have the pack in front of him.
It's so hard because these words are just synonyms in normal life.
Yes. I mean, yeah, sure. They're very similar. I'm also seeing a rare here. I wonder if this card was printed at uncommon in a different set. Or maybe maybe it's a peasant-ish cube with a couple of rare exceptions. But the pack is Triskelion, Blightning again, Simic Growth Chamber, Dragon Hunter, Gitaxian Probe, Sulphur Falls, Basri's Acolyte, Darksteel Ingot, Havoc Jester, Orzhov Signet, Overgrown Tomb, Wall of Limbs, Fearless Fledgling, Waker of Waves, and Skywise Teachings.
There's so many good options here. I think I think all the bounce lands, like Simic Growth Chamber, that enters the battlefield, you return a land, but then it taps for 2 mana, are incredibly powerful. It's just like drawing 2 lands, basically. Obviously, the cost of a little bit of a tempo hit. But what I really like about taking them early is, even though they are dual-colored lands, which normally I would say, well, I don't want to pick it if I'm expecting to play a 2-color deck, because it's only 1 in 10 chance of being in the most open colors. But I'm honestly really happy in most environments to just play these, even if they're only in one of my colors, because of the inherent card advantage. So that's worth noting. Similarly, I think Signets just are extremely powerful in lower powered environments, because they give you so much like mana fixing and tempo advantage to let you just put out a bigger threat before your opponent can. But I think what I'm leaning towards is actually Waker of Waves, which is the big whale that shrinks all your opponent's things and also has this cycling ability that is just a pretty good cantrip on its own.
Anthony, we gotta stop spending so much time together, because those are the exact 3 cards I'm looking at as well.
Well, you can't pick those. They've been taken. I think you should take the rare.
Yeah, I do want to underscore what you said about Simic Growth Chamber and the other bounce lands. I think in any environment that is not very fast, they are probably what I think the best, by a pretty decent margin, duels that always enter the battlefield tapped. Like, I think they're way better than the Scry lands, way better than, what's the next best? Way better than all the man lands, really. Maybe some of the best man lands or creature lands will kind of give them a run for their money, but yeah, to your point, it's basically just a land that says, comes into play, tap, draw a card. Like, and that card is a land. And, a land that draws a card and also is a land is really, really powerful.
And there are drawbacks to that, but, like, in my own cube, it's so much fun to be like, here's my, 3-color deck that's trying to do these big things, but I'm only playing 15 lands because I have, like, a couple good cantrips and multiple of these bounce lands. It just really feels like you're getting away with something in a way that I find really enjoyable.
There are slight drawbacks. The first thing I'll say is I don't love when these lands are in environments that also have land destruction, because they can be especially punishing. And I know some people probably have done that to like try and balance them out if I think they're very good. But I would hope there wouldn't be that in here. That would be a huge punishment for playing the bounce lands for sure. Really, the biggest cost, aside from playing a tap land in the first place, is that it does make your tapping a little awkward. It's kind of like a Signet in the sense that it forces you to tap in a very specific way, which actually I think very rarely impacts gameplay, but is the kind of accounting that I don't want to force my players to do, where it's like, I have to be very careful when I tap this land because I might need a color later, or I might need a specific number of mana at instant speed, and if I tap this land when I'm not thinking about I could mess myself up.
Yeah,
so,
you're totally right. It's like it doesn't usually, like, it's not a huge drawback. Usually you can still do everything you want to do in a turn. Just you have to figure out and make sure you sequence it right. But it just makes you care about a thing that really isn't what makes the game interesting, right?
Yeah, exactly. Basically, I think Simic Growth Chamber and Orzhov Signet are very similar in power level in your typical peasant environment. I don't know this list super well, obviously. We just got it from Joe, aka Fiend. I haven't looked at it super in depth. I think basically as the power level increases, the Signets get better and the bounce lands get worse, because the bounce lands operate on a purely value axis, right? They are not good for tempo because it's a bounce land, but they're great for value because it's a free extra card. So if you are playing games that are going to come down to value, then the bounce lands are incredible. Whereas a Signet is kind of the exact opposite. It is playing entirely on the tempo axis. It is basically just a land you have to pay to put into play, and for that cost of having to pay to put this land into play, you get to play an extra land that turn, right? You get an extra mana ahead of curve. So you can play your Signet on 2 and then play a 4-drop on turn 4. And so that really matters when the games come down to tempo, right? When your opponent is playing aggro and you have to play your 4-mana board wipe or your planeswalker or something to, stabilize earlier, or when, it really, the game is all about resolving this big kind of snowballing threat before your opponent does, and the tempo is really important. So I think oftentimes tempo is correlated with power level, just because the more you can do in a given turn, the kind of more powerful your cards are, the more tempo becomes relevant, because giving up a turn is a much steeper cost when that much more can happen in the same turn. And in Peasant, I think they're kind of about equal standing. In something like Pauper, I would not be very excited about taking a Signet, I don't think. I would be much more, just bounce land or bust, kind of. But out of this pack, I'm going to take the Growth Chamber. And I think Waker of Waves is the most appealing non-mana card once you take away all the lands in the Orzhov Signet. What do you make of Gitaxian Probe in a Peasant environment?
I like it more as a synergy card. How much is the information actually good for you in this context?
I don't know. I think that is another thing that is kind of correlated with, if not power level, tempo, where it's like, how many times would your sequence of cards really be altered significantly by knowledge of what your opponent had in their hand at that moment? And
I think that you're getting at, like, in a higher powered environment where you have really specific synergies, or you're trying to execute a really specific plan, and you have to worry about, does your opponent have the interaction right now? Otherwise, you are just wasting card advantage or wasting value to try and go for your game plan right now. Whereas I think in lower powered environments, it's more about just like building up your board state, making sure you get value in combat, stuff like that, where the information you get from Gitaxian Probe is just not that useful.
Right. So like in my own vintage cube, my Bun Magic cube, I play Gitaxian Probe, but I think it's very good. I mean, I think a free cantrip is very good. The 2 life, I'm happy to pay. There's plenty of benefits to, playing that spell. I've got the Delve spells, I've got stuff like that in that environment, so I'm happy to get another card in the graveyard. I think it's like a very good cantrip, but not amazing. Not like, something I'm usually going to be taking early in a draft. Not going to be taking pack one, pick one most of the time, for example. I do play this also in the Degenerate Microcube, where I think it has a very strong claim to maybe the best pack one, pick one you could ever make. Because in that environment, knowing what's in your opponent's hand is a huge benefit. Huge benefit, because it's all about how do my answers line up with your threats or vice versa. And knowing what your opponent is doing on turn one, before they've done anything, will dramatically alter the way you sequence your spells, because you have to play around a specific removal spell or a specific counter spell or something. And so it's free. You can put it in any deck. You don't have to pay mana to cast it. I rate it very, very highly in that environment. Here, I'm not super duper high on it. And I think I'm just going to start on that bounce land here, though I might, after a couple times playing this cube, realize I'd rather be on Signet. I think, honestly, the tiebreaker here for me is that I'd rather be playing green-blue than black-white in a Peasant environment most of the time.
Yeah, that's fair. And to be clear on the Gitaxian Probe, if I'm playing blue and I end up with it, it's always going to be in my deck. I just don't value that in terms of a pack one, pick one.
Oh, yeah, I'd put it in any deck, not even just playing blue.
Oh,
I'd
sure,
just jam
yeah.
it in basically any deck no matter what. But yeah, I don't know how valuable that information is going to be. And I think if the information is not valuable and you're playing it for these really small edges of like one more cantrip for your like Xerox Theory, one more card in your graveyard for Delve, and that's really the main value of it, then I'm not super duper high on it.
Same.
All right, we're going to call it there. Thank you, Joe, a.k.a. Fiend, for sending in your Peasant Cube list, and thank you again to all of our people that submitted cubes this time. Jason, Sir Magic Toast, Brimlock, Woplord, everybody, the whole crew. Thank you for sending in your cubes. If you want to have your cube on Lucky Paper Radio, you can achieve that dream. Just send it via email to mail@luckypaper.co and include your pronouns, include how you want to be credited. Give us a little introduction to your cube, and we'll put it in our spreadsheet and get to it sometime in the future. If you have feedback about the Pack One Pick One segment, please send it along. We are always trying to adapt and improve a little bit, so was it helpful for us to read the card name or the card rules text this time for the ones we were considering, or was that just a distraction? Let us know if there's a way we can make this even better. And also, let us know what you think of occasionally doing a all Pack One Pick One show. I don't know if this is more interesting, less interesting to people, but we do get more submissions. We get submissions at a faster rate than we can do them. And so if we want to try and keep up, I think doing a all Pack One Pick One show from time to time, it might make sense. So let us know what you think of that. Anthony, any closing thoughts?
I have no closing thoughts. I'm tired. We talked about too many Magic cards.
this did feel kind of hard. Yeah, all these pack one pick ones back to back, trying to imagine different contexts and how things are reevaluated. It's a lot to keep up on.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the fun and tricky part about Cube, is trying to take all these cards that we know and love, or maybe don't know, and reevaluate them again in a brand new context. But it is exhausting.
All right, check out luckypaper.co to see our end of the year review for all things Cube. We got some cool people participating this year, Anthony, including Emma Handy, including What Wolf, including some big names in the Cube community. So head on over there and check out that article. Thank you to James Nasty for producing all of our music. Thank you for listening, and thank you, Anthony, for talking about magic with me.
Anytime. I'd love to talk about magic.
Happy New Year, buddy.
Happy New Year.
Hey, to another year of Lucky Paper Radio.
To another great year, just like this last one.
To another perfect year, just like this one. This one was really good. Let's just run it back and do it all over again. Sounds great.